Hello and good evening. I'm going to be discussing some material on the Vietnam peace movement that occurred while the Vietnam conflict was going on. I'm going to give a brief overview of the conflict itself and how the peace movement coincided with the conflict in order to give you a good idea of why it occurred and what was happening in Vietnam during the time that the peace movements were happening domestically. The Vietnam protest movement began nearly the same time the public became aware of our involvement militarily in the civil conflict in Vietnam. Although the United States had been in country at an advisory capacity for many years, it wasn't until 1964 when the American public understood what that involvement would eventually mean in Vietnam. When the U.S. received military aggression from the North Vietnamese military in the tail end of 1964, Congress quietly authorized a large-scale military intervention. This was known as the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution. By the end of 1965, we had roughly 200,000 troops in South Vietnam, and most Americans couldn't point to it on a map. President Lyndon Johnson also authorized a bombing campaign called Operation Rolling Thunder that was initially supposed to only last a short while and ended up lasting 3 years. And at this time, we were officially at war in Vietnam. And most Americans couldn't tell you why. The reason for the war that was regurgitated for the public was said to be the spread of communism. It was true that North Vietnam wanted to unify under one communist government, but the South Vietnamese government was no better. Even though we backed it, they had a tendency to be just as corrupt and cruel as a potential communist government would have been. More scholarly individuals within the U.S. didn't see how we needed to be involved, and protests began to break out in smaller capacities. In 1966, the draft changed and it began to include college students who were on the bottom half of the ranking system. More protests began as students did not want to leave their studies to fight in a war they were not convinced of. And vets began to return from their tours, and they told tales of what was actually occurring in Vietnam, which furthered the cause towards anti-war protest. The American people were slowly getting the feeling that they were being fed lies, and they acted out. Media coverage helped to confirm atrocities affecting innocent populations in North and South Vietnam, and it added fuel to the protest fire and backed up the stories of the returning military veterans. Despite this, the presidential administration rose the troop ceiling to 525,000 troops, and that outraged the protest groups, and they began to demonstrate in a larger capacity. Many groups of protesters all around the country began to burn their draft cards or turn them in, and refused to be sent overseas to serve. Some even gave up their American citizenship and evacuated to Canada. During this time, the administration was telling the American public that we were winning, we were killing the enemy, and they broadcasted numbers of dead in a statistical attempt to sway the American opinion that we were succeeding. But on January 30th, 1968, a large-scale enemy offensive known as the Tet Offensive confirmed that the enemy was not being suppressed as the government had been telling us. Under pressure from protest and military advisement, the administration finally admits to themselves that there's no traditional victory in sight. They don't, however, say this publicly. Sadly, peaceful protest is put on hold and violence erupts as both MLK and Robert Kennedy are assassinated within 2 months of each other. 75,000 federal troops were called in over 100 cities to calm the rioting and the violence. Dozens of people were killed, and 71 fires were recorded to have been set. Later that same year, the Democratic Convention was held in Chicago. Although the mayor locks it down from protesting, thousands show up to protest the government and the war. Much of it was peaceful, but there were cases of violent outbursts that ended with arrest and injury. Nixon, now president, begins to withdraw troops slowly, but also announces the invasion of Cambodia. This enrages the protest groups, and a mass outcry occurs in hundreds of school campuses and cities. And in 2 cases, the National Guard executes students peacefully protesting. In Kent State, Ohio, 4 were killed, and a dorm building in Mississippi was attacked by the National Guard, and 2 students were killed, showing the nation and the world that we didn't have a handle on the situation domestically. We certainly didn't have a handle on it overseas. President Nixon continues to withdraw troops, but he also orders a mass bombing during the Christmas of 1972. He orders 36,000 tons, more than the previous 3 years of bombing combined, and the public responds with a demonstration that draws 500,000 people. Puts immense pressure on the administration. That's mounting pressure from demonstrations and backlash from foreign governments. Finally, a ceasefire is called, and the U.S. withdraws its troops. They do, however, leave the South Vietnamese to fend for themselves and forfeit on their promise to ensure that they are not recaptured by the North Vietnamese, unified under a communist regime. On January 27, 1973, the Paris Peace Act Accord is signed, and formally the U.S. ends military action. Fortunately, all of the sacrifices by American soldiers, as well as South Vietnamese soldiers, and all of the innocents that were killed in this war seem to have been for a lost cause. As in 1975, the North Vietnamese recapture South Vietnam and unify it under a communist government, essentially rendering the entire conflict null. As negative as this is, what is important to recognize is that the combined effort of protesters across our nation, alongside the press and the pressure from foreign nations, did eventually force our government to withdraw. There's no telling how long we would have stayed there had that pressure not been there. Many people risked personal injury, arrest, and even death to protest an unjust war. And in the end, it was put to halt. A war that admittedly we had no business being involved in. We showed the government that they can't force their agenda on the American people, and that we have the freedom and the ability to deny them our lives if we so see fit.